So I'd like to welcome you here to Marquette Law School, Eckstein Hall, the Lubar Center. As you know, the Lubar Center is technically the room below us as a physical location, but the Lubar Center and its work permeates the building as we talk about issues that affect the state and the region, as well as the city of Milwaukee. So thanks for the Lubar Center in its broad and expansive reach throughout the state. We've got some polling data. We've obviously going to have a little bit of a condensed version of this now, but I want to take you through the top lines on the horse race and a little bit about the candidates. There's much more about issues and other things in the race, but you'll just have to read those for yourself this time. Okay, so I'm going to skip the introduction of what our topics are. The methodology is the usual. We were in the field October 3rd through the 9th, interviewed 801 registered voters, 75% by cell phone. The full sample's margin of error is plus or minus 4.3 percentage points. Our likely voter sample, those people who tell us they're absolutely certain to vote in the election, is 652 with a margin of error of plus or minus 4.8. You might keep those numbers in mind. Is there any way to make that go away? That's quite problematic. It's not one damn thing, it's another, you know? I think I got it, Eric. Yeah, really, you know? Acts of God, acts of participants. Anyway, so we have our usual partisan balance in the sample. Let's just move on. It's very close to what the long-term balance is. General election matchups. Right off the bat, Ron Johnson has moved to a 6-point advantage over Mandela Barnes in the likely voter sample. So there's been some movement in that direction. If we look at the trend in our poll, we had Barnes by 7 the week after the primary, where he and, for that matter, Michels both got about a 5-point bounce from winning the primary. Then it tightened to a 1-point Johnson advantage in September, and now a 6-point Johnson advantage in October. Little perspective, recently we've seen a state poll about 2.5 weeks ago from Fox that had a 4-point Johnson lead, and one from AARP done by a pair of Trump's pollster and Biden's pollster together that had a 5-point lead. But most recently, we've seen a CBS poll with a 1-point Johnson lead and one other poll with a tie. So we're in that same region with Fox and AARP, but all three of us are a little bit more advantage for Johnson than the CBS poll from last weekend. So just some broader perspective about where we stand. For the governor's race, it's a 1-point Evers lead, 47-46. Beglinger, the independent, at 4, and a small number of people not choosing. Do remember that we ask people who are undecided, if you had to choose today, who would you vote for? So it's not just 2% that don't know. That's the 2% that are still undecided after we've asked them to make a choice if they had to. Here, the gap has also narrowed. In August, Evers was up by 4 points, then in September by 3, and now by 1 point. So a tightening. All of these are inside the margin of error. Remember, the likely voter margin was 4.8%. Okay. Partisanship remains very strong. We're seeing about 90 or 90+% of partisans voting with their party. It's been a little drop in Republican support from Michels from 92 last month to 88 this month, but that's a small movement. I wouldn't make much of it at this stage, though it's maybe interesting. But the purple bars for independents are, I think, the interesting part. If you look in the bottom left, in August, Evers had an 11-point advantage with independents. Then in September, that came down to a 6-point advantage. And now this month, it's actually Michels with a 1-point advantage with independents. So there's clearly been some shifts among independents, even as the partisans have largely remained with their party. And the short red bar and the short blue bar at 6% and 2% is the very small crossover vote of Republicans voting for Evers and Democrats voting for Michels. That's just a very small crossover at this point. In the Senate race, also the party loyalty is in the mid to upper 90s, still very, very strong. But independents, again, are the big part of what's changed since August. In August, Barnes had a 15-point advantage with independents. Then in September, it was Johnson by 2 points with independents. And this month, it's 6 points with independents for a Johnson advantage. So you see the consistency of this movement as we've gone in the overall vote from a 7-point Barnes lead to 1 point for Johnson to now 6 points for Johnson. So there's been a real steady trend. And it's not coming because partisans are changing their minds or deserting their party. It's because independents are being persuaded to shift their vote. We see some pretty big differences this time between all registered voters and likely voters. We've been showing you the sensitivity of the results all along in previous releases. So let's look at that here. So the people that say they're absolutely certain to vote over here on the left of all the charts, 84% of Republicans say they're absolutely certain, 83% of Democrats, with independents a bit lower at 69. Last month, it was 77 for Republicans and 80 for Democrats. So Democrats went up by 3 points, but Republicans went up by 7 points in certainty to vote. So that's brought a few more Republicans into the likely voter universe as they've gotten more committed to voting. But if you go back to August, it was 83-82, a 1-point Republican advantage. Now it's 84-83, a 1-point Republican advantage. September was a little bit of a shift in that. And so it looks like if Republicans lost any certainty of turnout, they've recovered it this time. If we look at what the vote would look like by 3 different electorates, the green bar is for all registered voters. And there, Evers has a 5-point advantage, 56-41. When you move to the purple bar, those are people who say they're absolutely certain or that they're very likely to vote. Then it becomes a 47-44 margin. It tightens a bit. And finally, if you go to only likely voters, those absolutely certain to vote, it's 47-46. So you see the difference between the registered voter numbers and the likely voter numbers. The bigger the electorate, the larger the turnout, the better the Democrat is doing. As we get to those who are just absolutely sure they'll vote, the race tightens considerably. Here's why there's a big difference. It's not because there's a big difference in certainty of voting. Remember, that was just a 1-point difference between Republicans and Democrats who were certain to vote. But what it is a difference in preference. The green bar here are the absolutely certains. That's the 47-46 for all likely voters. But the purple bars are for people who are anything less than absolutely certain to vote. The Evers vote stays about the same at 45, but the Michels vote drops all the way off to 26. So the differences we're seeing between likely voters and all registered voters is not because one party is a lot more mobilized than the other, but because the preferences of less likely voters, those not certain to vote, are different from the preferences of the most likely voters. This group is less involved in politics, less active, and a bit less knowledgeable of the candidates at this point. So one thing to watch as we go to the last poll before the election is what's happening with those less certain voters. Do their preferences shift over the rest of the campaign, or do they stay as lopsided as this? And if so, what happens if turnout is very high versus if turnout is just the likely voters that we usually expect to vote? The Senate race shows a similar, maybe even a more dramatic difference. This is where Johnson leads by 6 with likely voters, but it's a dead tie, 47-47 with registered voters. Then you move to a little bit smaller electorate, those certain or likely, and it becomes Johnson by 2. And then you move to the absolutely certain to vote, and Johnson has that 6-point lead. Exactly the same pattern we saw with the governor's race shows up here. Barnes's vote actually goes up a little bit from 46 to 52 with the less than certain to vote. But Johnson's support drops 20 points from 51 to 31 among those less certain voters. That's very similar to what we saw with the governor's race. Again, whether this persists, I don't know, but it's why we're seeing the big difference between registered and likely voters now is not so much that top tier of absolutely certain to vote, but it's what happens when you get to the next tier. Past analysis says that of those who say they're certain to vote, about 93% will vote. But when you go to the next level, people who say they're very likely to vote, that drops off into the 60% range or less. And so there is a big difference in turnout, though some of these less likely voters certainly will show up at the polls. It's just awfully hard to know. That's why we're presenting all 3 levels of the electorate, all registered, pretty likely, and absolutely certain to vote. Got a little time. Candidate images. This is the way voters see themselves in ideological terms. Very liberals on the left to very conservatives on the right. And the far right bar is the don't know percentage. And so you can see that there's a lot of people in the middle, 31% moderate. This is self-described moderates among voters. 32 conservative, 18 liberal, and then smaller percentages out. Here's how those same voters perceive the ideological position of the gubernatorial candidates. It's not really a surprise, but the perception of Tony Evers is considerably to the left of voters' self-perception. The perception of Tim Michels is considerably to the right. There's a bit of a notable difference. 23% say Evers as moderate versus only 8% that see Michels that way. So there's a little bit of a difference between those two candidates. Also at the extreme end, 25% see Evers as very liberal versus 32% that see Michels as very conservative. We're hearing some of the rhetoric from both sides about my opponent is too extreme, too radical, whatever the language is. There's some evidence that people see it that way. On the Senate side, it's still pretty similar. Most people see Barnes as liberal or very liberal, 32 and 32% each, but Johnson is seen as conservative by 39% and very conservative by 37%. So again, seen a little bit more to the right than Barnes is seen to the left. And whereas Evers had that 24% seen him moderate, it's a smaller percentage for either of these candidates to see them as moderate. So this is part of the story of polarization in our politics, that we see our candidates as rather far to the left or the right compared to where we see ourselves. And that's not entirely new, but it's certainly something that's been growing. I'm going to hit favorability and then I'll stop. Actually, both candidates for governor, Michels and Evers, are seen about equally favorably and unfavorably. This has not been a big change in their favorability or one of them being seen very negatively. They're both sort of middling levels of favorable and unfavorable. The independent Beglinger is not known to hardly anyone. But in the Senate race, a fairly similar pattern. Barnes about even, 39-40, and Johnson 41-45. That's actually an improvement in Johnson's numbers over recent polling, his favorability has improved, though it's still slightly net negative. There is a Democratic advantage on understanding the problems of ordinary people for both the governor and the Senate races, and shares my values. Again, a relatively even split between the candidates, here for governor, here for Senate. And so the takeaway from this is not only do we have a close race, especially when we're looking at registered voters, but people's views of the candidates are fairly even between positive and negative views. And that's true of all four of the candidates. We've still got a month of vigorous campaigning to go, so we'll see how those things change. But it's not the case that any candidate has sort of suddenly become a lot more positively viewed or a lot more negatively viewed, despite the deluge of advertising that you might possibly have seen if you ever look at television these days. Okay, I thank you for putting up with our disruptions today. We'll plan another tornado for a month from now. And the next release will be on the Wednesday before the election. So that's November 2nd, which I find terribly confusing that the election is that late in November. But November 2nd, here, with the weather approval, we'll actually get through the full release. And the release is being posted online at this moment. And so we'll also put up the slides for you to see the last 29 pages of the release. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you putting up with our problems.